Welcome. As you step through the creaking door into our humble abode, you'll find all the comforts and safety of home. Warm soup, a blanket, tea, perhaps something stronger as the tales are told. In Victorian England, 3 men brave a howling blizzard to find a neglected shack, which holds a horrifying secret. Do you dare venture into the cold, dark night with them? When you turn in for the night, dear traveler, leave a light on, for the shadows here are long and far-reaching, and the darkness is ever present at Ye Old Terror Inn.
A final letter to Mrs. Lindley. It is the 14th day of April in the year of our Lord 1837. I, Percy Collington, along with 2 other gentlemen, have discovered a most ghastly sight. The horror to which we have been exposed cannot be adequately expressed, nor can such dreadfulness be imagined, for it is surely the nightmare of a miserable dreamer. We stand gathered in a small room. I am holding the weathered journal that has so often kept my nocturnal ramblings, though on this distressing eve it is a record of the appalling imagery I see before me. The walls are of solid grey stone. To my immediate right is a table splintering with age. Random items are strewn across the surface. There is a piece of glass broken and stained on the floor. Our unfortunate eyes have taken hold of this room, and speaking solely with my own projection, I can foresee no circumstance strong enough to erase its existence from memory. It is somewhat curious that we have happened upon this room in the first place. Earlier I asked my beloved wife to excuse me from supper. Lovely as she is, my wife smiled gracefully and attended to other matters. Our delicious meal had been interrupted by an incessant pounding on the door, and I resolved myself to confront the messenger. I opened the door to find a haggard-looking gentleman who had clearly rushed through our otherwise peaceful village with some level of urgency. Snow fell from the sky like dandelion spores, and in the iciness of the wind, the man's breath preceded his voice as he spoke to me. I stood upon the threshold of my home, whilst threatening shadows crept across the land. Darkness had fallen, and in a few short hours I would unquestionably retire early to a deep slumber, as was my habit on wintry evenings. Though, as the haggard gentleman recounted to me in a terrible hurriedness his gruesome experience, it became evident that I should accompany him into the night. And so I did. Our footprints were swallowed in the white storm. Dimly lit houses were arranged between those which had chosen to sleep. The gentleman and I trudged on in a most determined manner. He continued to speak to me, and I became deeply engaged, lest I miss a detail of some importance. The inclement weather worsened as we held our overcoats and slogged into a tapered alley. With the blind trust of a child, I followed the gentleman for several blocks, listening absorbedly to his tale of unpleasantness. The modest homes in the village began to wane, giving way to larger dwellings inhabited by the affluent members of society. My extremities grew cold, and the gentleman acceded to my desire for warmth. He rapped his clenched fist against a nearby door of solid oak, which I immediately recognized as the home of a Mr. Charles Faraday. As the massive piece of wood opened to reveal a charming room, the gentleman and I stared through wind-swept eyes at a prominent man of wealth. Mr. Faraday welcomed us into his home and quickly settled down. As we conversed in the parlour, Mrs. Faraday emerged on the staircase in a most wonderful dress of turquoise satin. She offered quite graciously a selection of herbal teas and biscuits, which I and the haggard gentleman devoured as though we'd been starving for some time. A nearby fire crackled, chewing delicate branches and expelling a cloud of heavy warmth toward us. The haggard gentleman repeated his awful story to Mr. Faraday. Mrs. Faraday departed the room with a look of concern. I found her behavior alarming. An expensive assortment of cigars appeared in Mr. Faraday's hands. He fumbled inside his coat and, after a moment or two of frustration, set the end of his tobacco ablaze in the candlelight. Smoke lay in the air, hovering above our mortal heads like an apparition. I directed my eyes between Faraday and the gentleman continually, and at once Mr. Faraday appeared to become possessed with a series of haunting thoughts. His expression quickly became one of fright. His mouth contorted, and he struggled for breath. The gentleman spoke solemnly yet hastily, as if time itself was precious. I gazed upon the gentleman's hands, and queer though it may seem, they were soft and unthreatening, with a curious mark on the right thumb. Mr. Faraday arose from his grand early colonial-style furniture and prepared to accompany us into the driving snow, much to the dismay of his wife, whose sighs in the adjoining room were rife with safety precautions, though I suspect her objections were rooted in something else entirely. Moments later we three navigated the frosty, twisting roads, shielding ourselves in vain from the brutal climate. Faraday talked nervously and without end. The small paths blended together after a while, and a devilish bit of anxiety forced me to agonize over the notion of becoming lost and freezing in the moonlight. Faraday's ramblings faded as my imagination painted a still life in the colors of death. Cemeteries began to poke through the snow. Spires and gargoyles stretched into the sky and cast long finger-like strips of blackness across the town. Trees, once vibrant and alive, were decrepit, their eerie limbs arched like spiders. The bark torn away and replaced with rotting wood. The sound of whispering enveloped me. A most troubling arrangement of images appeared in every direction. Macabre surgeries, bodies carved apart by scalpels and knives, doctors gazing through emotionless eyes at their work, as if all humanness had been replaced with savagery. I heard laughter echoing in the emptiness of night. I felt disease traveling through my veins and consuming me from within. I knew these visions were imaginary and very likely brought about by the mysterious nature of the evening. Such thoughts were the stirrings of a haunted mind, and, despite all logic, I lent much credibility to the presence of evil. Reality slowly came back to the forefront, erasing the horrors I had unwillingly created. Faraday grumbled. I suspect his impatience had overtaken his curiosity. The snow had become increasingly violent, whipping our faces diagonally as the wind screamed like a children's choir howling in unison. In the distance was a clearing among many silver firs. The needles were like fingers pointing to the grey heavens. The haggard gentleman stopped and stared hesitantly. After what seemed like a fortnight, he pointed in the direction of a single house. It was old and forlorn, its only hint of life a muted yellow glow in 3 windows. Mr. Faraday stopped abruptly in the falling blizzard. the gentleman and I persisted until we reached the partially opened entrance, at which time the gentleman placed the flat palm of his hand against the door and pushed it forward. It responded with the creak of many centuries past. It must be said, before I continue with this account, that I am a respected man in society. My family has resided in this area since the end of the American Revolution. As such, we remain scrupulous and concerned for the reputation of future Collington generations. I cannot validate such stature for the haggard gentleman, but it is without reservation that I dare say he is a lucid, coherent, and credible individual. Surely he must be to some degree, for I followed him willingly to this accursed place. Mr. Faraday, you will remember, is of great financial wealth and stature, and therefore unlikely to fabricate his corroboration of this night. The details I will offer henceforth must be taken with the understanding that neither I, nor the haggard gentleman, or Mr. Faraday will benefit from the perpetuation of any untruths. We were suddenly rejoined by Mr. Faraday, who had stolen a moment to compose himself before entering the room. My stomach felt peculiar, and I suddenly remembered the elixir I kept at the side of my bed. It would do me no good. Mr. Faraday covered his mouth with the underside of his wrist. The haggard gentleman turned and scanned the room, so as to reassure himself that what he had originally seen was, in fact, realistically there. It can be considered nothing short of regrettable that his observation was correct. And here we have stood terrified for a quarter of an hour. Among the randomly placed items on the table is a letter signed by one Jonathan Lindley. We have established through a method of practical deduction that Mr. Lindley is indeed the man hanging before us, dead from an apparent suicide. Mrs. Lindley is the ill-fated widow, and it appears that this letter was composed by her deceased husband as a means of explanation, though it can hardly be expected to repress the sorrows of her abandoned heart. I will recite the content of Mr. Lindley's letter accurately and verbatim. The words hereafter are those of the departed. My dear Elizabeth, it is with sincere regret that I must put these words to paper. I have attempted to live as a man of practicality, and such actions as those to which I am about to confess are out of character. Despite my pathetic attempts to disregard the events of last evening, I fear my human emotions have stifled any chance for logical reasoning. What I have discovered of you, I'm confident, was not intended for exposure. Nevertheless, the pure wickedness of your dealings has infiltrated the very depths of my soul. As night fell on the world, I returned from my office with the intention of kissing you by the fireplace. You could not have foreseen my sudden arrival, and such was my plan, as I expected to find you sitting quietly in the parlour with your knitting. I rushed to the outside of our humble bedroom window with desire, where I thought to steal a moment of juvenile voyeurism before entering, and though I did indeed observe you in the bedroom, I did not observe you alone. Mr. Lander, who doubles as the local doctor and the conquest of many young women, was fully absorbed in your loving embrace. At once, I felt like something of great value had been pilfered. It was an explicit act with which I, as your faithful husband of 12 years, had been deeply familiar. Yet, as I perceived you in the throes of passion with Mr. Lander, I could not help but question how many lovers had satisfied you in my stead over the course of our union. I cannot place all of the blame for this sordid affair on your delicate shoulders, for I am content with the idea that a successful marriage is comprised of two willing participants, and my preoccupation with other duties has surely taken me away on occasion. However, I can and have placed a partial blame upon you. Shortly after my horrid discovery, I wandered the streets with a heart consumed by grief. I realized as I spent those very moments in a state of melancholy, you were experiencing physical pleasure in the grips of another man, who clearly possessed something I did not. That is, perchance, the greatest ache one can endure. Soon I came upon a pub in which I attempted to drown my sadness. I shall not pretend to misunderstand the full deterioration of my mentality, for even then I could feel it dwindling. Still, it must be stated that I remained sober for quite some time, that is, until more than an hour had lapsed. My fellow drinking companions drifted away one by one, leaving me victim to the internal demons I tried so desperately to subdue. The pub owner kindly yet sternly asked me to depart. I did so without incident. Any coldness I may have felt earlier had surely doubled as I walked into the unforgiving night, an embittered and deserted man. Allow me to tell you, my love, that I am not a believer in fate. It is therefore with no other explanation that I credit pure irony for placing me directly in the path of Mr. Lander as I rounded Colton Street. His face became aglow under the oil lamps. I could very distinctly identify a look of distress as he noticed me. It was no surprise, from his disheveled appearance, that he had recently left you ravished and naked in our bed, though he was outwardly unaware of my perceptiveness. In my inebriated condition, I was devoid of inhibition, and immediately attacked Mr. Lander with the remnants of a broken metal pipe lying nearby. The first blow struck him just above the right temple, and he fell to the ground, raising one hand in defense and using the other to balance himself on the frozen road. I brought the jagged pipe back and again swung it in his direction. The impact sent countless teeth into the feathery blanket. The contrast of his red blood against the purity of the driven snow was oddly beautiful. After delivering the pipe against his body with increasing fervor, I feared his screaming would alert the authorities. To remedy this, I tore a section of cloth from his coat and filled it with a small block of ice. I then forced his mouth open and jammed the block into his throat, guaranteeing a certain level of silence as I dragged his battered body to a neglected shack in a clearing of silver firs. It was a place I had known about for some time. With a newfound shelter from the awful weather, I spent the remainder of the evening torturing Mr. Lander in a variety of ways until he expired. I performed a meticulous division of his body with a portion of sharp glass until he lay broken in pieces. How ironic that we are now so similar. I realize that this will cause immeasurable damage to you, my love, but it can in no way compare to the heartbreak I've experienced. I am also aware that atrocities such as those I've committed cannot be expected to go unpunished. However, it was with expediency that I decided to relieve our justice system of one more trial. If you have been reading this confession of sorts, then you have unquestionably found my lifeless body hanging from a rafter in the very room which also holds the remains of your beloved Mr. Lander. You will not immediately find him, though a conscientious search will return his body to you in due time. Please understand that no words I have ever spoken will eliminate the lasting effects of this evening, just as no explanation you could have offered would remove the images of your infidelity from my fragile spirit. If there is a God above us, then I will come to him on the day of judgment and atone for this mortal sin. I can only hope that when you appear on the threshold of death, you will find a justification great enough to deliver you from the eternal fires of hell. Your loving and ever faithful husband, Jonathan.
Ye Old Terror Inn is owned and produced by Carol M. Ford Productions. All rights reserved. No portion of this podcast may be used without written permission. A Final Letter to Mrs. Lindley was written by author Gary Sweeney and is copyrighted to the author. Gary Sweeney has written everything from short stories to a recently released memoir. He loves history, suspense, horror, old Hollywood, and would prefer if it were fall all year round. Gary pulls his inspiration from the horror classics. He states, "I've always loved the slow burn of Edgar Allan Poe's works and the subtle fright hidden in his descriptions. I wanted to evoke a feeling of dread without splashing each paragraph with gore. Though some of that certainly creeps in, the anxiety of the buildup is where the real terror lives." A Final Letter to Mrs. Lindley was narrated by Jeff Reim. For archived episodes of this podcast, visit yeoldterrorinn.com. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, our hosting site Spreaker, and everywhere podcasts are found. Authors, do you have a story you'd like to submit for consideration for production? Podcasters, do you want to participate in an episode or promote your show in our podcast? Visit our website, yeoldterrorinn.com, for more information.